The radar screen went dark at 3:47 hours, and with it, any trace of call sign Revenant 6. The air traffic controller at Bagram stared at the empty blip space where the A-10 Thunderbolt II should have been, his hand frozen over the communications panel. He'd heard the missile lock warning, the burst of static, then nothing. 47 seconds of silence that felt like falling through vacuum. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos, voices overlapping as officers scrambled to coordinate search and rescue. But General Marcus Thorne stood perfectly still at the situation map, his jaw set in that particular way that meant someone was already being written off. He reached for the red phone that connected directly to CENTCOM, and his first words were simple, final. "We've lost Revenant 6. Pilot KIA presumed." The other pilots in the ready room heard it over the intercom feed. Some looked away. A few shook their heads. One, a cocky F-16 jockey named Cade Rieson, actually scoffed. "She pushed too far," he muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. "I told them sending her on night interdiction was a bad call." No one contradicted him. Revenant 6, Captain Iris Cato, had always been the outsider, the one they tolerated but never quite trusted. She flew too low, stayed out too long, and had a reputation for taking hits that should have killed her. They called her reckless behind her back. They called her lucky to her face. But luck, everyone knew, ran out eventually. What none of them knew yet was that 600 miles northeast, in a mountain past the maps marked as Grid Echo 7, something impossible was happening. The A-10 was still flying. Barely. Its right engine was gone, blown apart by a surface-to-air missile that had detonated close enough to shred the turbine into expensive confetti. The left engine screamed at temperatures that should have triggered automatic shutdown, but someone had overridden the safeties. The canopy was missing entirely, torn away when Iris had ejected it manually to avoid the smoke filling the cockpit. Wind hammered through the open space at 200 knots, cold enough to freeze blood in the veins. Iris Cato's hands moved across the controls with the precision of a surgeon and the desperation of a drowning woman. Blood ran from her hairline down her temple, mixing with hydraulic fluid that had sprayed across the instrument panel. Her oxygen mask dangled useless. She was breathing the thin, hostile air of 11,000 feet through gritted teeth. The flight suit was torn at the shoulder, and her left arm throbbed where shrapnel had kissed it. But her eyes were locked forward, calculating angles and distances, reading the dark landscape below like a language only she understood. She was 70 miles from friendly territory, flying a broken machine that physics said shouldn't be airborne, and she was going home. The missile had come from nowhere, which was another way of saying it came from exactly where intelligence said it wouldn't be. Iris had been tracking a convoy through the Khyber approach, her infrared pod painting the vehicles in ghostly white against the black terrain. The mission brief had been clear: observe and report, do not engage unless fired upon. She'd been doing exactly that, circling at 15,000 feet, when the radar warning receiver exploded with the panicked chirp of an SA-15 gauntlet locking on. She'd had maybe 3 seconds to react. She dumped chaff and flares, threw the Warthog into a diving spiral that pulled 6 GS and made her vision tunnel at the edges, but the missile was already committed. The warhead detonated 30 feet below and behind her, close enough that the blast wave felt like getting hit by an invisible truck. The right engine died instantly. Fire warning lights blazed across the panel like a Christmas tree designed by sadists. She activated the suppression system, felt the chemical agents flood the engine bay, but the damage was catastrophic. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Flight control surfaces responding sluggishly. She ran through the emergency procedures from memory, hands moving in the sequence she'd practiced 10,000 times in simulators and hoped to never use for real. Airspeed falling. Altitude falling, the mountains below rising up like teeth. Ejection would have been the smart choice. Pull the handle, trust the rocket seat and the parachute and the survival training. Let the $40 million aircraft become a fireball in some unnamed valley, and maybe get picked up by a rescue bird before enemy forces found her. But Iris looked at the terrain, did the math in her head, and knew the truth. Ejection was a death sentence. They were too deep in hostile territory. The closest American forces were over an hour away even by helicopter. She'd be alone on the ground, injured, in an area crawling with people who would love to parade a captured American pilot on television. So she made a different choice. She kept the dying warthog in the air and pointed it west, toward Pakistan, toward the border, toward anything that resembled hope. The left engine was redlining, temperature gauges showing numbers that would make an engineer weep, but it was still producing thrust. The flight controls were mushy, delayed like flying through mud, but they responded. And most importantly, the aircraft was still obeying her will, still accepting her commands, still fighting alongside her. That's when she jettisoned the canopy. The smoke in the cockpit had become unbearable, thick and chemical and poisonous. She'd reached up, found the emergency release, and pulled. The canopy tore away in the slipstream with a bang that she felt more than heard, and suddenly the world was wind and noise and cold so intense it burned. But she could see. She could breathe. She could fight. Iris muscled the stick, trying to coax altitude from an aircraft that wanted to fall. Every instinct screamed at her to climb, to get height, to give herself room for mistakes. But altitude meant exposure, meant showing up on radar, meant giving other missiles a chance to finish what the first one started. So she stayed low, threading between mountain peaks, using the terrain to mask her from enemy sensors. The A-10 groaned and shuddered, metal screaming under stresses it was never designed to handle. Rivets popped somewhere in the fuselage. A control surface was vibrating itself to death. She could feel it through the stick, a high-frequency buzzing that spoke of imminent structural failure. She switched her radio to emergency frequency, keyed the mic. "Any station, Revenant 6, emergency situation, I am." Static swallowed her words. She tried again, got nothing but white noise. The communication system was fried, or the antenna was gone, or both. She was alone in the most literal sense, cut off from the world, flying a corpse of an aircraft through enemy territory with nothing but determination and spite keeping her airborne. The mountains began to give way to foothills. Iris checked her mental map, triangulated from landmarks she could barely see in the darkness. 50 miles to the border, 45. The engine temperature was still climbing. Oil pressure was dropping. She was leaving a smoke trail visible from orbit, painting a line across the sky that said, "Here I am, come kill me." But she was still flying, still heading west, still refusing to die. Her vision started to blur at the edges, hypoxia and blood loss ganging up on her consciousness. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper, used the pain to sharpen her focus. Not yet, not when she was this close. The left engine coughed, stuttered, caught again. She could almost hear it begging her to stop, to end this, to let it die with dignity. "I know," she whispered to the aircraft, to herself, to whatever gods watched over fools and pilots. "Just a little further, please." The forward operating base at Jalalabad had received the KIA notification from CENTCOM at 3:55 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Voss, the squadron commander, had taken the call personally. She'd known Iris since flight school, had watched her evolve from a nervous student pilot into one of the most capable close air support specialists in the Air Force. She'd also watched the way the institution ground against Iris, the way competence was never quite enough to overcome the fact that she didn't fit the mold. Too quiet, too strange, too willing to take risks that made the safety officers nervous. Voss had fought to keep Iris in the cockpit, had gone to bat for her a dozen times against commanders who wanted her flying a desk instead. And now she was gone, erased from the sky in a single moment of bad luck and worse timing. Voss sat down heavily in her office chair and stared at the personnel file on her screen. Captain Iris Cotto, 29 years old, 217 combat missions, Silver Star for valor in a mission she'd never talk about, daughter of a Navy corpsman who died in Fallujah when she was 16, no living family except an aunt in Oregon who barely knew her. Voss would have to make that call, would have to find words for a loss that had no adequate description. She pulled up the casualty notification form and started typing. each keystroke feeling like a small betrayal. In the ready room, the other pilots were already moving on. Cade Rieson was holding court, explaining to a group of younger aviators how Iris had screwed up, what she should have done differently, as if hindsight and distance made him qualified to judge. The SA-15 has a minimum engagement range, he was saying. She must have been too low, gave them a perfect shot. Classic case of pushing your luck one time too many. A few of the listeners nodded, filing away this wisdom from a pilot who'd never taken an SA-15 missile and lived. But in the back of the room, Captain Marcus Webb sat silent, staring at nothing. He'd flown with Iris on dozens of missions, had seen her do things with an A-10 that seemed to violate the laws of physics and common sense. She had an instinct for survival that bordered on prescient, an ability to feel threats before they materialized. If she'd been shot down, something had gone catastrophically wrong, or she'd been in an impossible situation with no good options. Webb didn't buy the "she pushed too far" narrative. Iris didn't push too far. She pushed exactly as far as necessary and no further. That was what made her brilliant. That was also what made everyone else uncomfortable. He stood up and walked out, ignoring Cade's story, and headed for the operations center. Something didn't sit right. The timeline was too fast, the declaration too certain. They'd called her KIA less than 15 minutes after losing contact. That wasn't protocol. You searched first, you verified, then you made the call. Unless someone had decided the search wasn't worth the risk. Unless someone had decided she was expendable. The border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is more a suggestion than a reality in the mountains, a line on a map that the terrain ignores. Iris crossed it at 4:21 hours, flying at 2,000 feet above ground level, the A-10 held together by willpower and the tears of maintenance crew members who would see the damage and have nervous breakdowns. The left engine was making sounds that no engine should make, a grinding shriek that spoke of bearings eating themselves alive. She'd lost most of her hydraulic pressure. The flight controls were responding purely through mechanical backups, cables and pulleys doing work that should have been handled by sophisticated power systems. Every input required force, muscling the stick and rudder pedals like she was flying a bomber from 1943. But she was over friendly territory, or at least territory that was nominally friendly, which in this part of the world was the best you could hope for. She'd managed to coax out another 1,000 feet of altitude, enough to start scanning for somewhere to put down. The A-10 could theoretically land on a highway if necessary. It was designed for rough field operations. But looking at the mountains below, she wasn't seeing many highways. What she was seeing was a lot of rocks and a lot of ways to die. The engine fire warning light came back on. This time the suppression system didn't help. She could smell burning, toxic and sharp even in the wind-blasted cockpit. Flames were visible in her peripheral vision, licking along the wing route. She had minutes at best before something critical failed, something she couldn't compensate for or jury-rig or bully into submission. She needed to be on the ground now. That's when she saw it. A dry riverbed cutting through a valley, relatively flat, maybe a mile long. Not perfect, but perfect was a fantasy. This was survival. She lined up on the approach, fighting the controls every inch of the way, and keyed the radio one more time on emergency frequency. Any station, this is Revenant 6. I am over Pakistani airspace, grid November Papa 4721. I am going down. Aircraft is on fire. I say again, I am going down. She had no idea if anyone heard her, but she said it anyway because that's what you did. The landing gear wouldn't come down. Of course it wouldn't. The hydraulics were shot and the emergency extension system had failed or been damaged, which meant this was going to be a belly landing, sliding the aircraft in on its titanium bathtub, the armored underbelly that had saved countless A-10 pilots from ground fire. It was designed for this, built to take punishment. She just had to trust it. Trust the engineers who designed it. Trust the maintenance crews who'd kept it flying. Trust herself to get the approach right, because she wouldn't get a second chance. She dumped what little fuel remained in the left wing tank, trying to reduce fire risk. Armed the emergency locator beacon. made peace with whatever came next. Then she dropped the nose, cut the throttle, and aimed for the riverbed with every ounce of skill and luck she had left in her body. The impact was violence. The A-10 hit the ground at 140 knots, the belly striking hard-packed earth with a sound like the world ending. Sparks fountained up in a rooster tail behind the aircraft as titanium screamed against rock. She was thrown forward against the harness, the straps cutting into her shoulders with enough force to crack something. She didn't know what and didn't care. The aircraft slewed sideways, the left wing digging in, and for a terrible moment she thought it would flip, would cartwheel and tumble and turn into a fireball that would vaporize her before she even felt pain. But the wing tore away instead, ripped from the fuselage, and the sudden loss of mass on that side actually helped stabilize the slide. 300 yards, 200, 100. The A-10 plowed through sand and gravel and the remains of ancient floods, shedding pieces of itself with every yard. The left stabilizer departed. More of the wing structure tore away. The nose gear assembly, retracted but still vulnerable, was crushed and ground away. Iris held on to the stick even though there was nothing left to control, held on because letting go would mean accepting this was over, and she wasn't ready to accept that yet. 50 yards, 25. The aircraft was rotating, spinning slowly counterclockwise as friction grabbed asymmetrically. The remaining engine tore loose from its mount, bouncing away in a shower of flames and debris. 10 yards, 5. The Warthog came to rest against a boulder the size of a bus, the impact gentle compared to everything that had come before, almost polite. Then silence. The sudden absence of engine noise and wind and chaos was so complete it felt like falling. Iris sat in the wreckage, still strapped in, still breathing, still impossibly alive. Her hands were shaking. No, her whole body was shaking, adrenaline and shock and cold, and a dozen other things she didn't have names for. She reached up with fingers that didn't quite work right and started unstrapping, the harness release refusing to cooperate until she hit it with the side of her fist. The straps fell away. She tried to stand and her legs buckled. Sat back down hard in the ejection seat and laughed, a single sharp bark of sound that might have been hysteria or triumph or both. Then she smelled the fuel and the burning, and survival instinct overrode everything else. She forced herself up, climbed out of the cockpit on arms and legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and half fell, half jumped the 15 feet to the ground. Her ankle twisted on landing, pain shooting up her leg, but she kept moving, stumbling away from the wreckage. Put 50 yards between herself and the aircraft. 100. Then her legs finally gave out completely, and she collapsed into the sand, rolling onto her back, staring up at a sky that was just beginning to show the first gray hints of dawn. She'd made it. Against physics and probability and the assumptions of generals who declared her dead, she'd brought herself home. The broken A-10 sat smoking in the riverbed behind her, a monument to stubbornness and engineering excellence. And somewhere, eventually, someone would come looking. They had to. She'd survived this much. She could survive a little longer. At Bagram Air Base, the operations center was running on muscle memory and paperwork. The search and rescue request had been filed, then quietly shelved when CENTCOM confirmed the KIA status. No point risking more lives for a recovery mission, especially not in that terrain, especially not that deep into questionable airspace. General Thorne had moved on to other matters, other missions, other pilots who might still be saved. The war didn't stop for one lost aircraft. It never did. But Marcus Webb wasn't letting go. He'd cornered the air traffic controller who'd been on duty during Iris's last transmission, a young airman named Tors who looked like he hadn't slept since the incident. "Walk me through it again," Webb said, his voice calm but insistent. "Every detail." Tors pulled up the radar logs, hands moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency despite the exhaustion. She was here, tracking the convoy in Echo 7, altitude 15,000 standard patrol pattern. Then the RWR spike. We got telemetry on that. It was definitely an SA-15 lock. She initiated evasive maneuvers. We could see the track break as she dove and turned. Chaff and flare deployment confirmed. Then, he paused, pointing at the screen where the radar track simply ended. Contact lost at this point. We tried to reacquire, cycled through frequencies, nothing. She just vanished. Webb leaned closer, studying the data. How long from RWR spike to contact loss? 47 seconds. And you're certain the missile hit? Torres hesitated. We got the proximity detonation, the energy bloom showed up on satellite, and the track disappeared right after. So yeah, we're certain there was an explosion near her position. But you didn't see the aircraft actually explode. You didn't get a secondary bloom, no debris pattern, no confirmation of complete destruction. No, but... So she could have survived the hit, could have gone low below radar coverage, could be trying to make it back. Torres looked uncomfortable. Sir, the general made the call. She's KIA. We're not authorized to. I'm not asking for authorization, Webb said quietly. I'm asking for truth. Is there any evidence she's actually dead, or did we just assume the worst and stop looking? The silence that followed was answer enough. Webb walked out of the operations center and headed directly for the hangar where his own A-10 waited. The crew chief saw him coming and read his body language immediately. Sir, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I need a bird ready to fly in 30 minutes. Full fuel, emergency rescue kit, and don't log this flight plan until after I'm wheels up. Sir, you'll get court-martialed. Probably. Get me ready anyway. The crew chief hesitated for maybe 5 seconds, then nodded and started shouting orders to his team. Some things were more important than careers. Some people were worth the risk. Iris woke to the sound of rotor blades. For a confused moment she thought she was dreaming, that her mind had given up on reality and decided to offer false hope instead. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of a helicopter, and she forced her eyes open. The sky above was fully light now, pale blue and indifferent. Her body was a catalog of pain, each injury announcing itself as consciousness returned. But she was alive, still alive. She tried to sit up and the world spun. Nausea hit her in a wave and she rolled to her side, dry heaving because there was nothing in her stomach to bring up. When the spasms passed, she managed to prop herself on one elbow, looking around for the source of the rotor noise. There, coming in low from the west, a Black Hawk in U.S. Army colors, probably a medevac bird from the Combat Support Hospital at Jalalabad. Someone had heard her transmission. Someone had come looking. She tried to stand and made it to one knee before her strength gave out. Tried again, fell again. Her right leg wasn't cooperating, the twisted ankle having swollen to the point where the boot felt like a tourniquet. But she had to get their attention, had to signal, had to make sure they saw her before they flew past. She looked around desperately for something to use, anything bright or reflective. Her survival vest had a signal mirror. She remembered that basic equipment. She fumbled for it with hands that felt like blocks of wood, found it, held it up and tried to angle it to catch the sun. The Black Hawk altered course immediately. They'd seen her or seen the wreckage or both. The helicopter came in fast and low, flaring to a hover about 50 yards away, too cautious to land until they'd verified the area was secure. Iris understood that, approved of it even through her exhaustion. Don't take unnecessary risks. Don't become another casualty. Two pararescue jumpers fast-stroked down, hitting the ground with weapons ready, scanning for threats. When they were satisfied the area was clear, one of them ran toward her while the other maintained security. The PJ reached her and dropped to a knee, hands already moving through a medical assessment with practiced efficiency. Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Carver, pararescue. We're here to get you home. Can you tell me your name? Kato, she managed. Her voice was a rasp throat destroyed by wind and smoke and screaming. Captain Iris Kato, Revenant 6. Carver's eyes widened. Jesus Christ, they said you were KIA, they said. He shook his head, keyed his radio. Alpha 7, I have the pilot, she's alive. I say again, the pilot is alive and responsive. We need immediate medevac. The other PJ had moved to the A-10 wreckage and was staring at it with undisguised disbelief. "Carver, you need to see this. She flew this thing here. She belly landed this thing." "I can see that, Ramirez. Help me get her on a stretcher." They were gentle but efficient, loading her onto a litter despite her protests that she could walk. She couldn't, not really, but pilots had pride and injured pilots had more pride than sense. They carried her to the Black Hawk and handed her up to the flight medic, who immediately started an IV and began checking vitals. The aircraft lifted off almost before they were fully aboard, the pilots clearly wanting to get out of disputed airspace as quickly as possible. Iris lay on the litter and watched the ruined A-10 shrink below her, that faithful machine that had refused to quit, that had carried her through the impossible and asked only that she not give up. She owed it her life. She owed it everything. The aircraft disappeared from view as the Black Hawk banked west, heading home, and she closed her eyes and let the exhaustion take her at last. At Bagram, Lieutenant Colonel Voss got the radio call at 5:38 hours. She'd been preparing to send the casualty notification, had the message drafted and ready to transmit. The voice of the Black Hawk pilot crackled through her handset, professional but unable to completely hide the amazement underneath. "Ground control, this is Medevac 73. We have recovered Revenant 6. Pilot is alive. Injuries appear non-life-threatening. We are inbound to JALALABADCSH. ETA 20 minutes. Voss stood frozen, the handset pressed to her ear, not quite believing what she'd heard. "Say again, Medevac 73. Did you say alive?" "Affirmative, ground control. Captain Cotto is alive. Repeat, alive." Voss sat down slowly, relief and anger and a dozen other emotions hitting her at once. Relief that Iris had survived. Anger that they'd given up so fast, that they'd written her off so easily. She pulled up the casualty notification form on her screen and deleted it, every word erased, as if she could make the whole thing never have happened. Then she picked up her phone and started making calls. People needed to know. People who declared Iris dead needed to be informed they were wrong. General Thorne received the news in a briefing about an unrelated operation. His aide leaned in and whispered the update, and Thorne's face went through a remarkable series of expressions in about 3 seconds. Surprise, disbelief, something that might have been embarrassment, then the careful neutral mask of a senior officer who refuses to admit error. "Confirmed?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir. The rescue team has visual confirmation it's her." Thorne nodded slowly. "Well, that's good news. Unexpected, but good. Make sure she gets the medical attention she needs, and I'll want a full debriefing once she's stable." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that he'd been wrong. That he'd written off a pilot who deserved better. That his assumption of death had been premature and perhaps motivated by factors that had nothing to do with tactical realities. But General Marcus Thorne had been in the Air Force for 32 years, and in that time he'd learned that admitting error was optional but maintaining authority was essential. So he moved on to the next briefing item, the next decision, and filed Revenant 6 under problems that resolved themselves. In the ready room, someone had changed the status board. Captain Iris Cotto, RETURNED from mission. Cade Rieson stared at it for a long moment, his confidence from earlier evaporating. Around him, other pilots were gathering, talking in low voices, processing the impossible news. She'd survived. Not just survived, she'd flown a destroyed aircraft back from the dead, had landed it against all odds, had done something that would become a legend in the community. And he'd spent the last 4 hours explaining to anyone who would listen how she'd screwed up, how she'd pushed too far, how her death was her own fault. He felt Marcus Webb's eyes on him from across the room. Webb didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The judgment was clear. Rieson left the ready room without a word, heading for somewhere he could pretend he'd been right about anything. The Combat Support Hospital at Jalalabad was expecting a routine trauma case, maybe some shrapnel wounds and a concussion. What they got was Captain Iris Cotto being wheeled in on a stretcher, covered in blood and hydraulic fluid, and the dust of 2 countries, looking like she'd been in a car crash with a mountain. The ER team swarmed her, cutting away the remains of her flight suit, cataloging injuries, shouting medical terminology that all boiled down to "she's alive, and we're going to keep her that way." Broken ribs, grade 2 concussion, lacerations across her scalp and arms, that sprained ankle which was actually a hairline fracture, severe dehydration and hypothermia, and a puncture wound in her left shoulder from a piece of cockpit shrapnel that had somehow missed every major vessel and nerve. She was impossibly lucky, or impossibly tough, or both. They cleaned her up, sutured what needed suturing, splinted what needed splinting, pumped her full of antibiotics and fluids and painkillers. By the time they were done, she looked almost human again, almost like a person who hadn't spent the night flying a dying aircraft through hostile territory. The doctor in charge, a weary major named Patel who'd seen too much combat trauma in his tour, stood at her bedside and shook his head slowly. "Captain, I don't know what you did up there, but the pararescue guys told me about the aircraft. They said it looked like it went through a shredder. How the hell did you fly that thing?" Iris, floating on a cloud of morphine and exhaustion, managed a faint smile. Carefully. Patel laughed despite himself. "Fair enough. You're going to be sore for a while, but you should make a full recovery. You're also probably going to be famous if that matters to you." "It doesn't." "Yeah, I didn't figure it would. Get some rest, Captain, you've earned it." She was asleep before he finished the sentence, her body finally surrendering to the need for unconsciousness now that the danger had passed. The nurses covered her with a blanket, dimmed the lights, and left her to the healing sleep that trauma patients need. Outside the ward, word was already spreading through the base. The pilot they'd declared dead had come back. The woman they'd written off had refused to die. Revenant 6, they'd called her. The call sign had always been a bit of dark humor, a reference to her tendency to survive missions that should have killed her. Now it felt prophetic. By evening, the story had reached the media. A military spokesperson, carefully managing the narrative, confirmed that an American pilot had survived a surface-to-air missile strike and successfully returned to friendly territory despite catastrophic damage to her aircraft. Names and details were withheld for security reasons, but the basic facts were explosive enough. Social media lit up with speculation. Aviation forums debated the technical feasibility. The A-10 community, never shy about promoting their aircraft, crowed about the Warthog's legendary toughness. And underneath it all, a question that no one quite asked out loud. If the pilot had been someone else, someone who fit the stereotype better, would they have been declared dead so quickly? Marcus Webb had made it as far as the flight line before Lieutenant Colonel Voss intercepted him. She didn't threaten him with court-martial or lecture him about chain of command. She just put a hand on his shoulder and said, "She's alive. Medevac picked her up. She's going to be fine." Webb sagged with relief, all the tension draining out of him at once. Jesus, where did they find her? Pakistani side of the border, about 60 miles from her last known position. She belly-landed the aircraft in a riverbed. She what? You heard me. The rescue team sent photos. The A-10 is totaled, but she walked away from it. Well, limped away from it. Webb, she did something nobody's going to believe until they see the pictures. Webb looked up at the sky, at the pale stars beginning to emerge in the dusk. She's tougher than all of us combined. Yeah, Voss agreed. She is, and after this maybe people will stop underestimating her. They stood together in the twilight, two officers who'd spent their careers fighting not just enemies, but also the institutional inertia that resisted change, that preferred the familiar over the capable. They'd both seen talented people ground down, seen good pilots driven out because they didn't fit the mold. Iris had survived tonight not because the system supported her, but in spite of the system. She'd survived because she was brilliant and determined and too stubborn to die. And now she was a hero, whether she wanted to be or not, whether the institution was ready for her to be or not. Some stories you couldn't suppress, couldn't spin, couldn't minimize. This was one of them. The C-17 carrying Iris back to Bagram arrived 3 days later. She'd insisted on returning to her unit rather than being evacuated to Germany, had argued with doctors and commanders until they gave in just to shut her up. The compromise was that she'd spend a week in observation at Bagram before making any decisions about return to flight status. She'd agreed, mostly because arguing further would have meant more delays. They'd given her a fresh flight suit and a pair of crutches for the fractured ankle. She looked like she'd been in a fight, bruises flowering across her face in purple and yellow, sutures visible in her hairline. But she was mobile and alert and deeply uncomfortable with the attention that greeted her when she stepped off the aircraft. There was a crowd waiting, not a formation or a ceremony, just people who wanted to see her, who wanted to confirm that the impossible story was true. Lieutenant Colonel Voss pushed through to reach her first, pulling Iris into a careful hug that avoided the worst of the injuries. "You scared the hell out of me," she said quietly. "Sorry, boss, wasn't intentional." "I know. Come on, let's get you out of here before this turns into a circus." But it was already too late for that. Word had spread that Revenant 6 was back, and pilots from every squadron on base had found reasons to be near the flight line. They lined the path to the Humvee, not quite at attention but close, a spontaneous honor guard for someone who'd done something that most of them couldn't imagine surviving. Iris walked the gauntlet on her crutches, acutely aware of every eye on her, feeling more exposed than she had in the cockpit with no canopy. Marcus Webb was waiting by the Humvee. He saluted, which she couldn't return while balancing on crutches, so he dropped it and just offered his hand instead. "Hell of a thing you did up there." "Thanks, I heard you were ready to come looking for me." "Seemed like the right move. Glad I didn't have to." "Me too." She climbed into the Humvee with Voss's help, grateful to be out of the spotlight. But as they drove toward the squadron headquarters, she could see people stopping to watch, pointing, talking. The story had already grown beyond her control, beyond the facts. She was becoming a symbol, a legend, something larger than just a pilot who'd gotten lucky and made it home. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. The debriefing took 6 hours, spread across 2 days. Intelligence officers wanted every detail about the SA-15 site location. Operations wanted to understand the damage assessment and how she'd maintained control. Safety wanted to dissect her decision-making process. And General Thorne, in a closed-door session with only Iris and Voss present, wanted to know why she'd chosen to attempt a return rather than ejecting. Iris explained it clinically, without drama. The terrain, the enemy disposition, the calculation that her odds of survival were better in the aircraft than on the ground. She didn't mention that part of her decision was based on not trusting the institution to come get her, on knowing that certain pilots were considered more expendable than others. She didn't have to. The general understood, she could see it in his eyes, that uncomfortable recognition that his own assumptions had been part of the equation. "You show,"